our distinguished guest, Matti Friedman. I'm Miriam Elman. I'm AN's Executive Director, and with me to moderate today's event is Refa Shams, AN Senior Associate for Communications. We're really delighted to have such a terrific turnout for today's event, and as everyone is being led into the room, I'd just like to welcome our many faculty members who are joining us this afternoon. We have members joining from campuses across the country. Many members who are joining for today's webinar have been with AEN since its founding in 2015, and they are with us today. And we also have some of our newest members who just joined this summer. So welcome to AEN. I'd also like to thank AEN's partners and our funders, a number of whom are with us today. Thank you so much for your ongoing support of our work and our mission. Before we introduce Matti, let me just say a few words about AEN's webinar series. Now, of course, if it wasn't for COVID, we'd be meeting with you all in person at convenings around the country, but we'll have to wait for that. For now, we are taking advantage of online formats. Some of you attended our members-only town hall last week, an open forum where we discussed the many challenges we will face on campuses in the coming year. And for those of you who attended that, you know it was really a very lively conversation. Others of you have participated recently at our first e-conference or joined for previous webinars where we're hosting leading scholars and practitioners. Our goal as we pivot to these online formats is to ensure that we can continue to provide you, our faculty members, with useful and practical information and insight about Israel and about academic freedom and free expression on campus. We want to make sure that despite the unprecedented disruptions and upheavals in the academy, that we can continue to do our campus work effectively, from combating campus anti-Semitism and countering ongoing calls for academic boycott, to pushing back against empirically suspect and virulently anti-Israel narratives. So stay tuned for more information on these upcoming webinars. And we look forward to having you join us for as many of them as fit your schedule. For our program today, we've asked Matti to speak for about 15 minutes. And during his presentation, the chat function will be disabled. So just hold on to your questions and comments, and we'll turn the chat function back on after Matti's talk. And with that, let me now turn the floor over to my colleague Refa, who will introduce Matti.
Thank you, Miriam. I now have the distinct pleasure of introducing our speaker, Matti Friedman. Matti is an author and journalist living in Jerusalem, a former Associated Press correspondent. His writings have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Tablet Magazine, The Atlantic, and elsewhere. He is currently an op-ed contributor for the New York Times. He is the author of 3 award-winning nonfiction books, The Aleppo Codex, Pumpkin Flowers, A Soldier's Story of a Forgotten War, and his latest, Spies of No Country, Secret Lives at the Birth of Israel. Matti has written extensively on the experience of Mizrahi Jews in Israel and how this population is shaping Israeli politics, culture, and society. At a time when issues related to ethnicity and identity are at the forefront on many college campuses, and the complex realities of contemporary Israel are misunderstood or distorted altogether, Matti's perspective is a deeply welcome addition to the conversation. So with no further ado, Matti, please take it away.
Thanks, Rafe, and thanks, Miriam. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks to everyone who's with us this, I was gonna say evening, but I guess it's midday for some of you, depending on where you are in the United States. What I'm going to do, as Rafa said, is speak quite briefly. I'm going to try to sketch out this vast subject in about 15 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for questions and comments and see where it goes. My understanding of this topic really dates to a conversation in 2011. I moved to Israel from Toronto in 1995 when I was 17, and I lived here for many years and had a certain idea of what the country was. And in 2011, I was working on a book that ultimately became my first book called the Aleppo Codex, which is about a copy of the Bible that's hidden in Aleppo, Syria for centuries. One of the main characters in that book is an old, retired Mossad agent who himself was born in Aleppo, Syria. And at some point during our many conversations, he told me that I needed to meet a friend of his who is an even older spy, almost 90 years old, a man named Yitzhak Shoshan. I didn't know why Rafi wanted me to meet Yitzhak Shoshan, but I've learned over many years as a journalist that if someone offers to introduce you to an old spy, you should probably go. You won't regret it, even if you don't necessarily know why you're going. So I got into the car from Jerusalem, drove to Bat Yam, which is a suburb of Tel Aviv, went up a tiny elevator in this kind of very Soviet-style block of apartments, went up to the 7th floor and met Yitzhak Shoshan, who was a tiny guy with a mustache and glasses, and he had been one of Israel's first spies. And I had many conversations with Yitzhak over a period of years, and it ultimately became this book that was recently published called Spies of No Country. At the time, I didn't really know why I was speaking to him or what I was going to speak to him about. And he told me a story about the birth of the state of Israel that kind of blew my mind and really ended up shifting the way I see the country. He told me a story about being a kid, basically a street kid from Aleppo, Syria, part of the Jewish community of Aleppo, barefoot in the alleys of Aleppo in the 1940s, running away from Aleppo as enmity toward Jewish people rose in the Arab world, escaping to British Mandate Palestine to join the Zionist movement, trying to fit in among the European Zionists who made up the majority of the Jewish population here in the 40s, 90% of the Jewish population here in the 40s, and failing to assimilate. His identity was too different from the identity of the founders of the state to enable him to become one of them. He seemed too Middle Eastern, he seemed too Arab. His native language was Arabic. His appearance and his culture were appearance and culture that were native to the Arab world and not familiar necessarily to the Zionist pioneers who'd come mostly from Eastern Europe. So he tried to fit in by changing his name. His original name had been Zaki Shasho, which is a fairly common name for an Aleppo Jew. He starts calling himself Yitzhak Shoshan, which is a Hebrew name. He Hebraicized his name as many people did in those years, and it didn't help him fit in. His difference was still insurmountable as a Jew from the Arab world. At the time of the birth of the state, he was picked up by an amateur ad hoc espionage operation that eventually becomes the Mossad, but at the time was just kind of a very small group of self-taught spies, about a dozen of them. And on behalf of this operation, which was called the Arab section, he's given a new identity. The Arab section understands that if you have Jews who seem Arab, that is useful if you're looking for intelligence, because these people can be sent across enemy lines. So this kid who'd been born with the name Zaki Shasho and changed his name to Yitzhak Shoshan to sound more Israeli, although that was not a word used at the time, is now given a third identity. Now his name is Abdul Karim Muhammad Sidki, and he's a Palestinian Muslim from Jaffa. So he's been given an Arab identity and he's sent back into the Arab world. And when Israel is born, Yitzhak Shoshan, with his many aliases, is a spy in Beirut, and that's where he spends the first 2 years of Israel's existence. There's a much longer story there, but as he told me this story, this was 2011, so almost 10 years ago at this point, I walked out of his apartment onto the streets of Bat Yam, which is this suburb of Tel Aviv, and suddenly the street looked different to me. The country looked different, and it's because something that he had said had clicked with me, or the weight of his stories had kind of turned my head in a different direction that hadn't occurred to me before. When I came to Israel, I came with a very European set of stories, which I think would be familiar to many of you if you know the official narratives of Israel. These are stories about Theodor Herzl, the visionary of Zionism in Vienna, and pogroms in Eastern Europe, socialism and the kibbutz idea, and of course the Holocaust. This all loomed very large in my idea of what Israel was when I came here. And of course the heroes of Israeli history that I knew were heroes like Golda Meir and David Ben-Gurion and Moshe Dayan, the kind of the pantheon of European Zionist heroes. And that was my idea of what Israel was. And I understood that on the fringes or the margins of the national story, there were Jews who'd come from places like Morocco and Syria and Yemen and Iran and Kurdistan, but those people were never the story as far as I was concerned. They were kind of a decoration, they were kind of a garnish on the story of Israel. And that, I think, to this day, is how many people think of the state of Israel. And after speaking to Isaac Shoshan, Yitzhak Shoshan, over a period of many, many months and eventually years, walking out onto the street in Bat Yam, I realized that the population in Israel, the Jewish population in Israel, is half-half. So half of the Jews in Israel have roots in Europe, mostly Eastern Europe, and half of the Jews in Israel have roots in the Islamic world, half. So it's not a minority in the Israeli population. In fact, it's half of the majority. And I started to wonder how Israel would look if you saw those Israelis as the main characters and the European Zionists as secondary characters. What does Israel look like if you're a Jew from Aleppo, Syria, or if you're a Jew from Casablanca? And that way of seeing things ended up kind of reshuffling the way I see the country. And I've come to the conclusion that Israel can actually not be understood any longer. It's possible that it could never be understood, but it's certainly true in 2020 that the country can't be understood with the old paradigms that I mentioned at the beginning, stories about Jews coming here from Europe, because Israel in 2020 is primarily, in my opinion, a Middle Eastern society, not just because it happens to be geographically located in the Middle East, but because the majority of its population is native to this part of the world. The Jewish population in Israel is about 80% of the country's citizens. As I said, half of European descent, half descending from families who came here from the Islamic world, and 20% Arab Muslim. So if you look at the population of Israel, we're talking about a country that's solidly Middle Eastern or North African in its ethnic origin. And if you try to understand Israeli society, I think it needs to be understood through that lens. And I'm going to give three very brief examples. One seemingly superficial one is pop music. If you come to Israel, and this might be true of some people on the call, if you come to Israel and you turn on a radio station, just a standard pop station, if you turn on our local equivalent of MTV, what you're going to see or hear is a kind of music called Mizrahi. Mizrahi in Hebrew means Eastern, and it happens to be the generalized term for all Jews who came here from the Islamic world. The pop form called Mizrahi is the dominant pop form in Israel. It sounds quite discordant to Western ears, and it takes a long time to get used to, but it's the music that all the kids listen to. Mizrahi artists are the ones who fill the biggest pop venues in the country. I just wrote a story for the Times a couple months ago about one of the biggest Mizrahi stars of the moment, who has an even more complicated story because she's an Arab Muslim woman who converted to Judaism. But the genre that she has, in which she's become a star, is a genre that's very Middle Eastern in its sound. Why is the dominant pop form in Israel Middle Eastern pop? Because Israeli society is more Middle Eastern than anything else. And that's kind of a superficial example, but the noise on the street or the music of the society, the heartbeat of the society, is not a kind of music that's familiar to people who grew up in Jewish summer camps in America, for example, and not familiar to people familiar with Western top 40 radio. The beat of the country is a Middle Eastern beat, and that makes perfect sense if you know who the Israelis really are. A second example, religion. People who come here from North America are often surprised by the way Israelis practice Judaism, because it's very, very different from the way Judaism is practiced in North America. In Israel, you really won't find a conservative, reform, orthodox breakdown in Judaism. The more liberal denominations of Judaism don't exist in Israel to a significant extent. Instead, most Israelis would call themselves traditional. And when pollsters ask Israelis how they identify religiously, they'll often say that they're religious or secular because they've been trained to say that that's a European way of breaking people down. But in fact, most people exist on a spectrum of religious observance that's traditional. They might light candles on Friday night, as you're supposed to do according to tradition, and then go to a soccer game, which you're not supposed to do according to tradition. Or you might take a fasting on Yom Kippur really seriously, but you might have lots of tattoos, which are completely forbidden by Jewish tradition. That's quite common because people here don't have the idea that you need to be secular or religious, which is a Western idea. Secularism never really takes root in the Middle East. You belong to a religious community, a tribal community, and for Jews, there was no way out of the community. You lived in the community and you were flexible inside it, and that is very Middle Eastern. And that's the way Judaism is practiced here. There's a lot of flexibility in that system, but it doesn't look like a Western form of Judaism. And it takes Jewish people who come here from North America a while to wrap their head around what Judaism is here. Judaism here is primarily a Middle Eastern phenomenon. And even the Jews whose family backgrounds are European, as is true of me, even those Jews have become Middle Easternized over a few generations in the Middle East. Lastly, just to kind of blow through three fairly straightforward examples, politics. Israeli politics cannot be understood without understanding the ethnic fault line in Israeli society. And often Western observers try to understand right and left in Israel as being something similar to right and left in America. It has nothing to do with right and left in America. The breakdown is completely different. So, if we take Netanyahu as an example, the prime minister is, of course, a right-wing prime minister, believes in single-payer healthcare, state healthcare, tight gun control. One of his most powerful lieutenants, one of Netanyahu's closest allies, is also the most successful LGBT politician in Israel's history. Currently the minister in charge of police, Amir Ohana. He's married to a guy, they have 2 kids. He's an ultra hawk by Israeli standards, which makes no sense to an American trying to understand left and right in Israel, like left and right in America. Coincidentally or not, Amir Ohana is also of Moroccan extraction, just to kind of punctuate how things work very, very differently in Israel. Right wing and left wing in Israel has a lot to do with ethnicity. When Jews flooded into Israel from the Islamic world in the early years of the state, they were treated with disdain to a large degree by the labor establishment that was running the country at the time. And the insult was very deep and is still playing out in our political system. The Likud party, at the time led by Menachem Begin, did not have the same attitude toward these people, treated them with a lot more respect. As a result, the base of the Likud party to this day is not the settler movement, as is often thought in the West. It's Jews who came here from the Arab world or the Islamic world more broadly. And the reason that the Israeli Labor Party, which was always the flagship party of the left, functionally no longer exists in 2020, the reason that its support dropped and dropped and dropped, there are a few reasons, but a big reason is that they were always viewed with suspicion by the half of Israeli citizens who didn't come here from Eastern Europe. And when you hear Israelis arguing about right and left, often they seem to be arguing about the settlements or the judicial system, but actually it's a much deeper argument that has a lot to do with where your family came from. And if you try to understand Israeli politics without understanding that, you really, it's very hard to get anywhere. I'm just gonna say one last thing, and I'm gonna throw the ball back into Raifa's court. How did this misperception take root? Why are so many people convinced that Israel is a society of white Westerners? Why? It's clearly not true if you've ever stood on an Israeli street and looked at Israelis, but that is a very deep perception in the West. And I think there are a few culprits, and I think that one of the culprits is us in Israel, because Israel always wanted to be European. That was an important part of the Zionist desire. Jews had been treated as swarthy Oriental foreigners in Europe for centuries. And one of the things they wanted to be when they became free people was European. And if you look at the old propaganda posters that the Zionist movement used to put out, it would have a blonde pioneer working in the fields, with no shirt on, and listening to Beethoven at night in the kibbutz dining hall. That was a big part of the image that we wanted to have. It was never true, but that was the image. So it's partly our fault, because Israel always played down its Middle Eastern character because it didn't like it. And Middle Eastern music was kept off the airwaves in Israel, and people were discouraged from speaking Arabic. Jews who come here from the Middle East were kept out of the corridors of power for many, many years. It's only now really changing, out of the academy to a large extent, out of the cultural elites. We didn't like that part of our culture, and we kept it in the basement. And as a result, a mistaken picture of Israel was put out to the world. The other main culprit is of course the Arab world. And I think that there are deep reasons for the desire of many in the Arab world or the broader Islamic world, I should say, we don't want to leave Iran out of it. Iran, of course, is Israel's prime enemy at the moment, and it's not an Arab country. There's a desire in the Islamic world to portray Israel as a colonialist enterprise or as a kind of Rhodesia. And there are deep reasons, and it's of course not true if you just know anything about the Israeli population, but there's a deep reason for that. And it's to obscure what happened to the Jews of the Islamic world. In the 1940s, there were almost 1 million Jews native to the Islamic world. And with very, very few exceptions, they're all gone. And an entire ethnic world inside Islam was displaced en masse, beginning in the early 20th century, but really with incredible speed in the mid 20th century. About 800,000 Jews displaced from the Arab world and more who were displaced from non-Arab Islamic countries. And most of those people come to Israel. So if you live in downtown Cairo, for example, every day you pass a part of downtown Cairo called Harat al-Yahud, the Jewish quarter. It's a big part of downtown Cairo. It's still called the Jewish quarter. There are no Jews there. Where did everyone go? In every major Arab city, with few exceptions, there is a Jewish quarter. Where are the Jews? What happened to these people? Why did they all leave? Who took their property? These are painful questions for people in the Arab world. And one way you obscure it is by pretending that the Jews in Israel are all white people, crusaders who came from Europe, because it's very painful to admit that in fact the Israelis, or at least half of the Israelis, are actually your neighbor. The guy who ran the store down the street, your school teacher from Baghdad, those people were forced from their homes and had their property taken, and they became Israel. But that is a painful and complicated thing for the Arab world to deal with, and it's obscured by kind of promoting a simplistic or kind of mythologized picture of what Israel is, and it's given an incredible expression in Cairo. If you've ever been, there's a mural, this kind of vast socialist realism masterpiece that was created in Cairo to commemorate the greatest moment in Egyptian military history, which was the first day of the Yom Kippur War in 1973. And in this mural, you see Egyptian soldiers, heroic Egyptian soldiers, forging across the canal. And you see Israeli soldiers in various pathetic poses surrendering to the Egyptians. You see them begging for their lives like this and holding their hands up. And if you look at the Israeli soldiers, you see something really amazing, which is that they're blonde. All of the Israelis are blonde. And if you've ever seen an Israeli military unit, you know that Israelis aren't actually blonde. In fact, a lot of Israeli soldiers look like Egyptians. And in fact, at least some of the soldiers, the Israeli soldiers who were on the Suez Canal in 1973 were Egyptians, because there were 80,000 Jews who were displaced from Egypt, and most of them became Israelis. But if you start understanding that the Israelis are actually Egyptians, it's too complicated. So you have to make the Israelis blonde. And as a result, Israel's foes and Israel's friends have all come to believe this incorrect picture of Israeli society, missing so much of what makes Israeli society complex and rich, and so much of what makes it tick, which is that Israel is not just a revolution in Jewish history. Of course, it is a revolution. National sovereignty is a pretty big deal. But in many ways, it's a continuation of the Jewish presence that always existed in the Islamic world. And the Jews moved inside the Islamic world. They're no longer in Casablanca. They're no longer in Aleppo or Damascus. They're here in Israel, which is not that far away from Aleppo and Damascus. They've moved inside the Islamic world, but they're still here. And that's a continuation, not a revolution. And I think if we see things that way, the state of Israel becomes much easier to understand. Okay. Promised to be short. I was not as short as I promised, but Raifa, what did I miss?
Well, I don't think you missed anything, Matti. You gave us so much to think about. And really, first, from what inspired you to write your phenomenal book, Spies of No Country, to sort of your insights on Israeli culture, religion, politics, and then lastly, this rich discussion of the reasons behind the erasure of the Mizrahi. We're going to open it up now. The chat is now open, so please start sending in your questions, your comments via the chat function. As those come in, Rafa and I will ask you a couple of questions, start gathering audience questions as well. So let me start out with a question about your work on the media. You've written a lot about the Mizrahi experience in Israel, but many of the participants on the call today have also read your work and your analyses and your criticism of mainstream media organizations and their coverage of Israel and what they get wrong. So what do they get wrong with regard to the Mizrahi population and the Mizrahi experience in Israel and their role in shaping identity? Is it all wrong? Do they get something right?
Thank you for that question. And I think the articles that I've written, which are more critical of kind of the thrust of Western media coverage, that's linked, I think, to the story that I just told, in that I think a lot of people who love Israel love an imaginary country. And a lot of people who hate Israel hate an imaginary country. And you know, I'm someone who tries not to imagine the country. I try to see it. And it's even true of some people here. You know, they see one country out of their window, and then they sit down to write an article, and it's a completely different country. And as a result, there's this vast gap between reality in Israel and perceptions of Israel abroad. The gap is almost unbridgeable, which is why I wrote those articles, because I think that we can't even begin to have a discussion about what Israel is until someone points out that the story that everyone's getting is completely wrong. And it's completely wrong, not just in the details of whatever Netanyahu said yesterday, but it's wrong in many basic ways. And I think the regional context, the lack of regional context in the story, if I have to put my finger on one thing that's wrong, it's that. Israel is portrayed as if it exists in a vacuum. The Israel-Palestinian conflict is the way the news story is framed, but there is no Israel-Palestinian conflict, right? Israel's wars have been fought against Syrians and Jordanians and Iraqis and Lebanese. Israel's most potent enemy at the moment, unfortunately, is Iran. None of those actors are Palestinian. So if you meet just an average Israeli and they tell you their life story, it might go something like this. My father fought the Syrians in the Yom Kippur War. My grandfather fought against the Jordanians in 1948. My grandmother was born in Baghdad and got run out of Baghdad when the Jews of Iraq were expelled after the founding of the state of Israel. That's a very common Israeli story. It has nothing to do with Palestinians, because the Israeli story is regional. It's regional because our conflicts are regional, and it's regional because the Israeli population, the Jewish population in Israel, is itself partly regional displacement of minorities, which is a big story in the Middle East. Jews aren't the only minority displaced in the 20th century in the Islamic world, but they were the first to be displaced en masse. And what makes their story unique is that they weren't kind of strewn to the four corners of the earth. Most of them were concentrated inside the Islamic world, in the state of Israel, where they arm themselves and become part of a majority and kind of hold out, unlike the Yazidis and the Christians and the Zoroastrians and the Mandeans and all of the other Middle Eastern minorities. And I think if we understand the regional context, if we understand who Israelis are and what their problems really are, then all of these problems would be, if not solved, then greatly mitigated, both the misunderstandings about the ethnic character of Israel and the misunderstandings about Israel's political challenges. Israel's main political challenges are not what to do about the West Bank. That's a real challenge. It's a real moral challenge for me as someone who's on the liberal side of Israeli politics. It's not the only challenge, and it's not even the primary challenge. For Israel, you have to zoom out and see where we are and what we're dealing with, and then Israeli political behavior becomes easier to understand, even if you don't agree with it.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Matti. Considering that a lot of our audience, the vast majority of our audience, they're academics working on U.S. College campuses, you touched on this in your concluding remarks, but on many college campuses today, Israel is often accused of being a European colonial settler state, and Zionism is disparaged as racist and white supremacist. So in response to this, how do we incorporate Mizrahi narratives into the way Israel and Zionism get talked about on campus? What would that look like?
Right, I mean, that's something that I think you guys are much better equipped to answer than I am. I have the luxury, I'm in Jerusalem, I don't have to, I have other problems. I have a long set of other problems. But I think that what I try to do when I have these conversations is, first, I point out that the simplistic narratives that people have been exposed to are incorrect. And then, I try to start as close to zero as possible. In this country, it's a tiny country in the Middle East. Actually, it's misunderstood by many people, including some people who live here. Let's start talking about it. Who lives there? What's the makeup of the country? I think that the portrayal of Israel as a kind of an ethnic supremacist state has less to do with any attempt to really analyze events on planet Earth, and a lot to do with the role of Jews in the Western imagination. What's the role that Jews have played over many, many centuries in different societies? Jews are the illustration of what's wrong. And the idea of what's wrong in a society at a given time changes. Some people thought communism was a problem. Some people thought communism was a solution. Some people thought capitalism was a problem. But if you were anti-communist, then the Jews were communists. They were Bolsheviks. And if you were anti-capitalist, the Jews were bankers. And if you thought that nationalism was really good, then the Jews were cosmopolitans. And if you thought that nationalism was really bad, then the Jews were tribalists. And if you thought that racial purity was something to be strived for, then the Jews were racially impure. And so on and so forth. And it's something that goes back many, many centuries, probably to the early years of Christianity, where people needed a story about anti-Christians. Who are we? We are Christians. Who is not Christian? The Jews. And it's a deep way that people in the West have always understood the world. There's a great book about it called Anti-Judaism by David Nirenberg, the University of Chicago. It's a big kind of thick book. It's not like a beach read if you're looking for one, but it's called Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition. He argues that that's a big part of the Western tradition. When you have a problem that you see in the world, many people will identify Jews as being the ultimate illustration of that problem. So what's the problem that liberal people in the West these days see? And I would certainly put myself in that group, by the way. Inequality, racism, nationalism, colonialism, militarism, and what country is brought in to serve as kind of the embodiment of all of those problems, the only country that needs to be isolated or dismantled? It's the Jewish country. And that's either coincidence or it's not coincidence. And of course, I don't think it's a coincidence. So when I have these conversations, it's a mistake, in my opinion, to get defensive about aspects of Israeli policy or society. If the person you're speaking to is interested in that, absolutely, it can be, you can get into that. But often this is not a discussion about a real country called Israel. It's a discussion that people in America are having with themselves, about themselves, by talking about another country that exists in their imagination. And when you bring in facts like half of the Jews in Israel are from the Middle East, and they were, they're the result of, they're refugees, like other refugees that we might mention in the Middle East. Unless the person is really interested in the facts of the story, you often don't get very far, because what the Israel story is for many people on campuses, and what it was for many people in the media world when I was in it, I was an AP correspondent for 6 years. What Israel really is a projection of American problems. So if America has a race problem, that's the problem in Israel. And if Britain has a painful memory of colonialism, then Israel's problem is colonialism. It's the problem that you have illustrated with someone else. So sometimes I realize this is a difficult conversation to have, depending on who you're having with. You need to go much deeper than, let me explain to you a few things about Israeli society. I like to ask people why they're so interested. What makes this country so interesting? It's 1/100th of 1% of the world. Why do we hear so much about it? And often that leads to a more productive discussion than a discussion of the facts. But if your partner is interested in what Israel actually is, then yes, I think the existence of Mizrahim, the Middle Eastern nature of Israel, I think that is a very useful way to talk about the way this story has been warped, and to talk about the reality gap, and to try to move people back from this kind of crazy idea of what the country is, back toward reality, back toward a country that's very hard to understand, but it's fascinating and rich and complicated and surprising. And if you're interested in reality, there's a lot that can be discussed here.
Thank you. I'm going to combine, we're getting in a lot of questions, which is great. And I'm going to combine two questions that ask about potential demographic changes relating to what you're talking about. So the first is, with rates of intermarriage in Israel between Ashkenazim and Mizrahim and others, how do you see the ethnic roots of Israeli political divisions going forward? And then, kind of looking at it from another angle, Israel received in the 90s an infusion of significant numbers of Europeans from Russia to create a different mix in the population. How does that impact the demographic future of Israel and some of the trends that you've been noting?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And when we talk about Israeli society as being Mizrahim, meaning people with roots in the Islamic world, and Ashkenazim, meaning people with roots in the Christian world, these are vast generalizations, and they're useful for the conversation. But the truth is, it's very hard to know these days who is Mizrahi and who is Ashkenazi, because a lot of people have one parent who's one thing and one parent who's a completely different thing. I was once asked to figure out how many Mizrahim there are in the Knesset, in Israel's parliament. I sat down with a list and I realized within 2 minutes that it's absolutely impossible because things are pretty mixed up. So we can say in general terms that half of the Jews in Israel have roots in the Middle East, but a lot of people have one parent who's Iraqi and one parent who's Romanian, or one parent who's Iraqi and one parent who's Yemeni, and one parent who's Moroccan and one parent who's Tunisian, and it's getting very, very mixed. But there still is a divide. And often Ashkenazim, like me, think that the divide is a thing of the past, but it's not. And you can see it just by going to a university department in Israel. You'll see that most of the people at the, in the university faculty lounge are going to be Ashkenazim, Israelis of European background. And if you go to an unemployment office in a poor town in southern Israel, the people who you're going to see there are going to be Mizrahim. The economic divide is real. It's narrowing, but very slowly and not as quickly as it should be. And the ethnic divide is very much a real factor in Israeli society, and it's a real factor in Israeli politics. The question, it happens that I'm writing something about it right now, and this is one of the things I'm looking at. When the wave of immigration starts in the early 90s with the collapse of the Soviet Union, ultimately 1 million people come here from the former Soviet Union. Some intellectuals who are part of what we would call the Ashkenazi elite said, great, this is great because what we're going to get is an influx of Europeans. And there's a great quote from a newspaper editor at the time. He said, these people are coming, they love classical music, they love Chekhov, they're going to save us from the Levantine society that threatens to engulf the state of Israel. At the time, before the Russians come, we call them Russians even though many of them are Ukrainians and Moldovans, before the wave of immigration comes, Mizrahim are actually a majority. There are more Mizrahim in Israel than Ashkenazim before the Soviet immigration. And then the Soviets show up and they turn out not to be exactly what the left-wing elite was expecting. In fact, they're kind of Mizrahi in their political attitudes. They end up moving into parts of Israel that are heavily Mizrahi. And today, if you go to a Russian wedding, they play Mizrahi pop music. And politically, the Soviet immigrants and the Mizrahim, who have classically been right-wing, see eye to eye. It's a dog-eat-dog world. You can't be naive. We shouldn't trust the Arab world with our security. Maybe an adoration for strong leadership more than institutions, like courts. And that those are, gross generalizations, but there's some truth to them. And that's not at all what the Israeli left was hoping for when that immigration came. So you have a politician like Avigdor Lieberman, who's the most prominent, I guess, Russian or ex-Soviet, he's Moldovan politician. And there's not too much political distance between him and other politicians on the Israeli right, with the exception of issues of church and state. The immigrants who came here from the Soviet Union largely are not religious necessarily, and they resent the intrusion of the chief rabbinate into personal lives. Israel, of course, does not have civil marriage or civil burial. Those institutions are under the control of an ultra-Orthodox rabbinate, which is a big problem, particularly for immigrants in the Soviet Union, many of whom are not Jewish according to the most stringent interpretations of Jewish law, which means that if if your father is Jewish and your mother isn't, and they both came from the Soviet Union, you can't legally get married in Israel. And that's a big problem for those Israelis. And it's a big kind of a thorny political issue, but it's fascinating to see this society, which is seen by outsiders as a kind of monolith, Israelis, and people imagine the kibbutz movement and the pioneers and dancing around a bonfire or something. But this is an incredibly heterogeneous society. And if you talk to 10 Israelis on the street outside my house, and ask them what Israel is, they'll give you 10 completely different answers. And the fact that the place functions at all is kind of miraculous.
Okay, well, we have a number of other questions. We have some questions related to the recent news of normalized relations between UAE and Israel. And so one question is, do you think that the agreement and the normalization of relations with the Arab world will change the perception of Israelis as purely, European in the Arab world's eyes, and maybe outside of the Arab world as well? And a corollary to that as well is from another participant, Israel has been largely cut off from the Middle East in terms of trade, normal political relations, sport, forcing Israel over the years to try to be European, right, with its trade and sports competitions, etc. Is there going to be movement in what do you anticipate? Will that be changing in the next decade? How will it change? So related.
Great, thank you for that question. A great example of the last part of your question is World Cup soccer. It's a very sore point for Israelis because we've been cut off from the Middle East and boycotted by everyone in the region. Israel's national soccer team has to play in Europe, and it gets creamed. It never gets anywhere because the European teams are really, really good. If we could play here in our region, we might actually get into the World Cup, and that would be great for many Israeli soccer fans. The thawing of relations with the UAE and the interesting signs that we've seen over the past couple of years in the Gulf with the Saudis and others, that's, if you're looking for positive news, which is hard to come by these days, that is positive news. Something is changing here. It's changing not necessarily because of, a love of, Jews or Israelis or a realization that Israel is actually a native part of this region. It's changing because of cold, hard geopolitical realities, mainly the rise of Iran, which of course is an enemy of the Saudis as it is an enemy of Israel, and the lack of trust, I think, in America. I mean, the ties between these countries start to warm when people cease thinking that America is going to step in to stop the Iranians. And that happens during the administration of President Obama, where America's allies in the Middle East have a moment where they say, okay, we're on our own here. The Americans are, they got up to their neck in Iraq and Afghanistan. They're not coming in again to help anyone. We better sort this out by ourselves. And then you started seeing weird things, like an Israeli trade representative would show up in, at a conference with a Saudi, which never used to happen. And suddenly it's out in the open with the UAE agreement. There was an amazing moment last week when the Israeli delegation arrives in the UAE, and it's related to what we're talking about. And when I have a dream of the way things progress, it looks like this. A plane lands on the tarmac in Abu Dhabi, and the head of the Israeli delegation gets off the plane, and he's this small guy with a big kippah, right, a big skull cap. He looks Middle Eastern. He gets up to the podium at the airport, and he starts speaking beautiful native Arabic, because Meir Ben Shabbat, who's the head of the National Security Council, who was leading the delegation, his family came from Morocco, and he grew up with Arabic, and he speaks it because that's his native language. It's literally his mother tongue. It's the tongue of his mother. So that never used to happen in the Oslo years. And although my vote has always been for the left, the Israeli left was typically very divorced from the Middle East. In fact, it had really nothing but disdain for Middle Easternness, and had a lot of disdain for the Israelis who were Middle Eastern. You didn't see Yitzhak Rabin or Shimon Peres at the podium speaking native Arabic. That didn't happen. And suddenly it's happening, and it's interesting that it's when the Israeli right is in power that Jews who speak Arabic start showing up in positions of power, right? You can study Israel for years before you can really wrap your head around why that's the case. Another great example, the culture minister, until recently, a hardline hawk named Miri Regev, kind of the bane. Someone once called her Trump in high heels. She's the bane of the Israeli liberal elites, and she's constantly at war with the liberal elites. She's also from a Moroccan family, and a few years ago, she brought in an Arab singer to sing at Israel's Independence Day ceremony, which had never happened before. And she said, what does everyone want from me? We have a lot to learn from Arabic music, which of course is the music she grew up with because she's extremely right-wing and also Middle Eastern. Those two things go together in Israel. The native Middle Eastern identity and the right-wing vote, those go together. So coexistence, in my opinion now, which is not the way I used to think, is much more likely to come from that than it is to come from, nice left-wing, coexistence soccer games or, well-meaning get-togethers of Israeli kids and Palestinian kids. I think accessing our native Middle Eastern identity is actually going to take us farther. It's not, devoid of problems, but I think that interesting things are happening in that regard as well.
Great. We have a question about how religion is practiced and perceived in Israel. So as I'm sure you know, birthright trips always seem to promote images of ultra-Orthodox Ashkenazim as showing or representing Israel's Jewish identity, which, as you point out, is not how most Jewish Israelis actually practice their Judaism, and certainly not how most young American or Canadian Jews practice Judaism. So who's promoting this image, and how is it? Are there ways of changing this perception?
It's a great question. One reason that image is so familiar is that it's just such an easy image, right? Because you can, even like newspaper photographers, it's happened to me several times. I write an article about something that's completely unrelated to anything that has to do with ultra-Orthodox Judaism in Israel, but there's going to be a guy with a black hat in the frame because that's a really easily visible kind of iconographic representation of Jews. The guy in the black hat, everyone knows that what that is. And if you just show a random Israeli on the street, he's just a guy in jeans. He might not even be wearing a kippah. He looks maybe like he's Iraqi. What is that? What even is that? So I think that when you're dealing with some simple images or simple lessons, which is true of the media to a large extent, and it's also true of a short trip like Birthright, which is basically, the greatest hits. Come to Israel, I have no problem with it whatsoever, but it's, it's like seeing the Statue of Liberty and the Empire State Building. It's like, come to Israel, let's see a few things. Here's a Jew, look at him, he's very weird looking and exotic. It takes much more time and energy to understand the way Israeli Judaism really works. The ultra-Orthodox are about 10% Israelis. And Mizrahim are half, and even many Ashkenazim are now very Mizrahi in their practice. So understanding what that is takes a really long time, especially if you come from a North American Jewish world. If you grew up, for example, in a conservative synagogue or went to a Reform Jewish summer camp, and you come to Israel and you meet Middle Eastern Jews, the way they practice Judaism is very strange. It doesn't look like what it looked like back home, right? No one here goes to a Reform synagogue. Very, very few people go to Reform synagogues. You might not practice Judaism or you might not observe 90% of religious law, but you would go to an Orthodox synagogue when you go to synagogue. It's kind of like living in a Catholic country. Often Catholics won't start their own church, right? That's a Protestant idea that you start your own church. You might not go to your Catholic church, but that's the church you don't go to, right? You don't start something else. And that's the idea that many Israeli Jews have. They don't think you need to pick and choose, really. You can, as we mentioned, you say the blessing over the wine, and then you go to the movies. You, of course, every year you fast on Yom Kippur. You never dream of not doing that, but you eat food that isn't kosher, and you drive on the Sabbath, which is forbidden. That works in Israel, and it's very present in the world of Mizrahi music too, where a lot of the singers are simultaneously openly religious, and they'll sing songs about religion, and they practice. They'll Facebook themselves visiting the graves of righteous rabbis and things like that. And at the same time, they're into gay rights, and they've got a lot of tattoos, which is forbidden, and they're kind of liberal in other parts of their life, and their music clips are full of scantily clad dancers, which is completely in contravention of religious law. Somehow that works here because it's the Levant, and it's a Mediterranean style of religion that takes a while to figure out if you're from the West.
Well, we're a group of academics, Matti, so of course there are going to be questions about what else should I read and what can you recommend to read on these topics. And particularly one question as well, I'm working on a curriculum to learn Israel from a Mizrahi perspective. where should I start to develop that curriculum?
Oh, wow, those are great questions, and I might try to put something in writing after the conversation, and my answers might be better. There isn't a lot written on this topic. There are resources, but because this side of Israel's experience has been kind of neglected for many years, the writing about it in English is really only starting to happen. The Israel that's been of interest to most people in the West has always been the European Israel. And this strange Israel that's actually Middle Eastern has kind of not been on anyone's radar, and that's beginning to change. And there are a few great books by Norman Stillman, who's an important scholar of this part of important scholar of the Jews of the Islamic world. Bernard Lewis has a really good book called The Jews of Islam, which is a history of Jews in the Middle East. There's a book called The Forgotten Refugees, which came out not long ago, which is about seeing Mizrahim as a kind of movement of refugees in the Middle East. There's some great memoirs. One particularly good one is called The Man in the White Shark-Skin Suit by a writer of Syrian Jewish extraction whose name is Lucette Laniado, who recently passed away, but it's a beautiful book about her family. There's also a book called Remembering Baghdad, or is it Forgetting Baghdad? It's either Remembering or Forgetting, by an Iraqi Jewish writer named Naim Katan, Qattan, who wrote in French. And there are a few others. By Andre Assiman also has a very good memoir called Out of Egypt. So if you're looking for personal writing about it, it does exist, but it's really only starting. And one reason that I've tried to write about it is because there aren't very many people doing it. Certainly not in English. In Israel, the discourse is very much centered on this. But the writing about Israel in English changes more slowly, in large part, I think, because the people who write about Israel in English tend to be people who have come from North America to Israel, because the North American Jewish community is almost entirely Ashkenazi. It's 90% Ashkenazi. The people doing the cultural bridging are largely Ashkenazim and have typically taken little interest in the non-Ashkenazi experience in Israel. But I think it is changing, and I'm trying to make it change as fast as possible, of course.
Thank you so much. And I see in the chat a number of our colleagues are suggesting a few other things. Jacqueline Lavis Sapir from Miniskirt to Hijab. One AN member saying that students really love The Man in the Sharkskin Suit. Remember Baghdad, also excellent. Rachel Shabi's book, We Look Like the Enemy. And a shout out also to our friend and colleague Hen Mazig, who's written quite a bit, as you have, popular articles that get a lot of play on being Mizrahi. Refa, turn it back to you.
Yeah, so we have a question about so Israeli President Reuven Rivlin famously spoke about what he sees as the 4 tribes of contemporary Israeli society and politics. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, those are secular Jews, national religious Jews, Arab Israeli citizens, and ultra-Orthodox Jews. How do you understand this argument about the 4 tribes, and how does it overlay with what you've spoken today regarding the tensions and the change dynamics between Israel's Middle Eastern and Western identities?
I think that there's some truth to that breakdown, but it's a heavy simplification, because I think we can certainly talk about the ultra-Orthodox as being a group, although there are many breakdowns inside the ultra-Orthodox world. Of course, it's not a monolith. It's the same is true of Arab Israelis, about 20% of the population, of course, and they are distinct. They're in culture and religion, most of them are Muslim. But even inside that community, there are many different factions, and you can see it in their representation in parliament, right? The representatives in parliament include communists, nationalists, and Islamists. And it's not a monolith by any stretch of the imagination, but I don't think Israelis break down into secular and religious. And I think that's kind of a classic European misunderstanding. There are secular people here, and there are religious people, but most people are in the middle. And when you look at polls, as 2 scholars recently did in a book called Israeli Judaism, Portrait of a Cultural Revolution, which is by Shmuel Rosner and Camille Fuchs, which is a really interesting book. It's mostly polling information. And you'll see that when people are asked if they're religious or secular, they'll answer. But then when they're asked, do you light candles on Friday night? Yes, of course, everyone does. Do you believe in God? Yes, of course. Do you believe in the power of prayer? Yes, of course. These are the secular people. So actually, it's not really secular religious. Actually, it's a spectrum, which is true of a Middle Eastern Jewish community. You have the more stringent people, you have the less stringent people, but most Israelis are neither religious or secular. And I think it's much better to understand the society in that way. That breakdown is European. It never existed in the Middle East, not just for Jews, but for Muslims as well. There was never a secular option in the Islamic world. That revolution never happened. In this part of the world, you lived in a religious community and you had some flexibility inside it, but you couldn't leave it. And just being a citizen, that idea never caught on, and that's true of Jews here too. So the tribal breakdown is true to some extent, particularly when speaking with people who aren't really familiar with the society, but I think it's much more useful to look at the society as a spectrum of observance. I think the country makes more sense that way.
Just as a note for those of you participating who attended AEN's national conference in San Diego last year in 2019, we had the author of Israeli Judaism as a keynote speaker. One of the last times we did an in-person event and could see many of you. And so thank you for mentioning that. I think we have time for one more question, and I will ask. This is a pretty specific question about policy. Discussions on the Palestinian right of return often get connected with the experience of Jews fleeing from Arab lands, which you spoke about. Do Mizrahi Jews themselves make this connection and advocate for their own restitution and compensation?
That's a very good question, and there have been attempts in the past by the political class to link the movement of Jews from the Islamic world to Israel with the movement of Palestinian refugees out of Israel in 1948. The numbers are similar. About 800,000 Jews are forced out of the Islamic world in different circumstances and come to Israel, most of them, and about 720,000 Palestinian refugees, according to the numbers that most people quote. So we're talking about a similar population movement, and there's been a political attempt to link those two things, and I think that I wouldn't want, there is truth to it, of course, but I wouldn't want this story just to be a political card, to be dealt in a poker game with the Arab world. Oh, you have refugees, well, so do we. I think that this needs to be part of our understanding of the state. And one thing that's got in the way of that understanding has been a resistance to the idea that these Jews are refugees. Because in the Israeli national story, everyone wanted to come. We call it aliyah, going up. Everyone's an ole, right? No one's a refugee, but the truth is, if you look at the Israeli population, not just Mizrahim, Ashkenazim as well, almost everyone would have stayed home if they could have. And there are very small groups that come because they're ideologically motivated. Most people come here because they have to, because they have no choice. And that's true of the Ashkenazim, and that's true of the Mizrahim. The word aliyah, or the idea of the ole, is an incredible weapon in the arsenal of the Zionist movement because it allows helpless people to feel powerful. We say you're not a refugee. You're a pioneer. You weren't rendered homeless. In fact, you're coming home. That was never your home. Now you're home. It's a narrative fiction. And it's a powerful narrative fiction that I personally love because I think it's part of Israel's success. This country does not see itself as a country of victims, and the Jews who were forced out of the Middle East do not see themselves as refugees because they've been empowered by what has happened to them subsequently. But their departure was, in most cases, forced. It was a forced population movement. It was an ethnic cleansing. And I'm glad we don't see it that way because seeing yourself as a victim leads you nowhere good. And if you look at many parts of the Arab world, you'll see that that's true. One reason that Israel is successful is that we don't feel sorry for ourselves in that way, and we don't ask for refugee handouts from the UN. And Israel's an incredible story about refugees taking their fate into their own hands, not just Mizrahim, but also Ashkenazim. And part of me wants to recognize the injustice that was done to these people and the way that fits into the kind of mosaic of injustice in the Middle East, because of course an injustice was done to the Palestinians and an injustice was done to the Jews of the Islamic world, and those injustices are connected and need to be understood in order to understand the whole picture. At the same time, I don't want us to feel sorry for ourselves. And I'm glad that we've told ourselves a story that gives us power in the world and doesn't reduce us to self-pity.
Thank you so much, Matti. I think that's all the time we have. This was a fascinating and timely and important discussion, and we're really delighted that you were here. For the participants on this webinar, we'll be following up with you with a survey. Please stay tuned for next steps on future AEN webinars and events. We are looking forward to engaging with you, and we are obviously going to be online for the near future. So please stay tuned for information about future events. I think that's it. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure.